one other thing maybe I should very quickly mention is that the Australian Constitution came into being within the British Empire. However, the British Parliament has abdicated the power to legislate for Australia. It did so in 1986. It did something similar in Canada in 1982. And so as a consequence, now Australia's constitutional destiny is entirely in Australian hands, which was always, I think, an objective of the Australian framers. They just didn't think there were grounds for revolution. So there was no Boston Tea Party and there was no Australian Revolution. Rather, there was an evolution of independence in Australia, just like in Canada. I think it gives you a bit of a sense.
Have there been any other notable cases where the High Court has made a new inference or new interpretation of the Constitution?
Yeah. One other area, probably the other big area, involves the judicial power itself, the separation of powers. So that, just like in the United States, the notion of the separation of powers as part of the Constitution is a structural inference. But there's nothing explicit even here that says the legislature shall not exercise executive power, or the president shall not legislate, something like that, which would be an explicit denial of the capacity to exercise executive power by the president, something like that. Of course, the line about what defines legislative power and executive orders, of course, is a technical question. Now, in Australia, that's similar. Now, building on that notion of the separation of powers, and remember how I said that it's the separation of judicial power that's very important in Australia? Well, the High Court has said that by inference, as an implication of the system, the courts cannot be given anything that appears to be legislative or executive any kind of executive or legislative powers. And similarly, non-judicial bodies can't be given judicial powers. And that's seen as very important because the general separation of judicial power from the other political powers is seen as an important protection of freedom. Because, as Montesquieu argues, if you combine the powers together into single hands, there's potential for corruption. Because as Lord Atkin says, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, or tends to. So the court has drawn that sort of an inference. And further, it's taken it quite a few steps further and said that the integrity of the judicial process needs to be maintained. So that you can't, for example, even take a judge and give them, as a person, any responsibilities while they continue to hold that judicial office that undermine the integrity of the courts as a separate branch of government. And further, another important example, although this has been more a matter of obiter dicta, a statement of principle rather than an actual decided case, is that they say that the Parliament cannot pass a bill of attainder or of pains and penalties and legislatively convict somebody of a crime. The conviction of somebody of a crime and their sentencing to criminal punishment must occur by a court following a full curial process of trial. And so the discussion there is whether this implies certain rights that the criminally accused might have in response to a charge. And so they are seen to be implications of that separation of powers. But that is still a fairly open-ended area of jurisprudence.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicholas. And we'll let everybody get on to class.